I'm Shahar Azani, and in the news, fight rages between Israel and Palestinian terrorists in Gaza amid talks of a possible ceasefire in what is called Operation Breaking Dawn. To hear more of what's happening on the ground and as the situation unfolds, I'm happy to welcome to JBS again our dear friend, Carrie Keller-Lynn, political correspondent for the Times of Israel. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Shahar.
How are you feeling?
I feel great. I feel great, especially because I feel incredibly lucky to live in Tel Aviv, which is a place that was relatively safe from rockets this last operation, these last 3 days.
Well, first of all, on behalf of JBS and all of our viewers, happy birthday.
Thank you.
I'm sure that's not the fireworks you were expecting.
People could say no publicity is bad publicity, but just like I don't agree with that, I also agree there's no such thing as no fireworks being bad fireworks.
Right. So you actually were just in the southern city of Ashkelon, weren't you?
I spent the day there. I spent the day there because I learned that something like 25% of the city's 150,000 residents don't have adequate access to shelter, which is a mind-boggling situation when you consider that Ashkelon is only about 7 miles north of the Gaza Strip and was one of the cities that was most pummeled by rockets in last year's May operation. So this isn't even old news, this is new news. This happened a year and 3 months ago that Ashkelon received about 1,000 rockets over the course of the 11-day operation. And the fact that these 40,000 residents still don't have adequate shelter is just mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, it really is. So tell us a little bit about your visit there. You spoke with the people. What's the sentiment on the street? How did you feel? What are you hearing from the people?
Well, let's start with a little anecdote. So there's a certain way that you drive when there's an operation going on, specifically when there are rockets coming. You drive with the windows down and you drive with the radio on, because if you're listening to one of the Hebrew language news stations, they'll interrupt broadcasts and let you know where there are current red alerts or sirens going on. And so I was kind of getting to this neighborhood that I knew in Ashkelon is really unprotected. And all of a sudden, a siren happens. I have to kind of ditch my car and I run into the nearest building. And of course, I'm in a neighborhood without shelters. There's no adequate shelter in this building. And I end up chatting with the family. And that's how we got rolling for the day.
Where did you go? In the absence of shelter, where do you hide?
In the absence of shelter, you do what makes you feel most comfortable, which for most people is hiding in the stairwell. However, I'll mention that a lot of these older buildings were conceived before the first Hamas rocket was fired into Israel in 2006. So these older buildings have these beautiful open entryways with outdoors, wide open lobbies. And so the stairway is basically a way to view the street very clearly. There's no real protection there. Most people just try to take solace in the fact that the stairway provides more protection than their apartments might.
And what was the mood like? You said you spoke with families, you met with the people. Describe the feeling to us.
Incredibly tense. It's interesting. Younger kids, they're playing. Everyone's on their stoop. Nobody was on the streets. Barren. It was almost like a ghost town. Nobody is on the streets. Everyone's playing sort of on the front stoop or right in the entranceway of an apartment to be close to a shelter if they have it, or to the stairway if they don't. But as the kids kind of get older, they're a little bit more quiet. The parents were all very subdued. You could really feel the weight of not just their stress, but obviously their children's stress upon them. And Shahar, I think the most interesting thing that I saw is that a lot of families, especially with large numbers of children and single parent families, either because the single mothers or the fathers don't work close to home, actually kind of decamped these large public municipal shelters. And so you're wandering around the neighborhood and you'll see these huge concrete boxes and you climb down the stairs. I'm sorry, there's a red alert going on right now. So Shahar, let's take a pause. I'm going to go into my protected room.
Absolutely.
That's okay.
We'll wait for you. As we're speaking, the red alert siren is on in Israel. It's an unfortunate depiction of the reality that Israelis have to live under at the moment, when the Islamic Jihad and Palestinian terrorists are specifically and indiscriminately targeting Israeli civilians in the hope of injuring and hurting as many as possible, while Israel is pinpointing attacks against Palestinian terrorists, trying to avoid civilian casualties. Of course, this does not reflect itself in the news or in the international organizations reporting of the situation that are very quick to blame Israel, similar to the incident in Jabalia over the weekend, when Palestinian terrorists were firing missiles that rebounded and ended up killing children in Jabalia. Immediately blame, the finger was pointed at Israel, but Israel was able to show by video the trajectory of the rocket, and that it's not Israel to blame for the killing of those innocent children, especially that Israel did not attack Jabalia at that time. But that did not stop the attack on social media, the incitement and propaganda against Israel. The battle on the ground is many a time accompanied by this social media battle for public opinion, in which Israel continuously, I have to say, is getting better, but is trying to show the realities on the ground for so many Israeli civilians. We have seen this kind of situation, unfortunately, many a time.
Shahar, I'm just going to come back now. The siren stopped, but I don't know if you can hear in the background, there are large booms from the Iron Dome explosions.
And you are in the Tel Aviv area.
I'm in the Tel Aviv area, where the current time is about 20 minutes out from 8 p.m. 8 p.m. is supposed to be an Egyptian-mediated ceasefire agreement. Very common, something that we'll see before ceasefires, or kind of a last hurrah, large amounts of volleys beforehand. One of the reasons I left Ashkelon when I did today is because I expected that there would be a large volley there. I wanted to leave before that happened. In fact, when I pulled into Tel Aviv, I saw alerts on my phone that there were some large volleys. We're seeing now in Tel Aviv, there are additional ones. Unfortunate reality.
Unfortunate reality. Carrie, I want to tap into your political wisdom and your savviness, and talk a little bit about, what we're seeing now and what we've seen in the last decade and decades. Continuous rounds of escalation, violence, rockets, repeats, international condemnation. Do you feel it's a repeat of the same menu? How do you see things?
I actually think that this current operation, if the ceasefire holds, if the ceasefire holds, actually would be one of the more successful Gaza operations that we've had in recent memory. First off, it will have had clear objective goals. It will have clear objectives, and it will have met them. Israel went in to eliminate a credible, concrete threat that it had from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and it assassinated 2 of its top leaders, as well as destroyed a number of installations. It did that in 3 days. If it actually ends the mission now, if it ends the operation before a catastrophic event occurs, both either on the Palestinian side or on the Israeli side, this would be a resounding success on both of those fronts. As a second point, it's actually really interesting. This was an initiated mission. This wasn't an operation that was kind of a tit for tat that kind of spiraled into something a little bit like we saw last year in May. This was a very deliberate choice on part of both Prime Minister Yair Lapid and Defense Minister Benny Gantz. And it sort of ticks that box that Yair Lapid was missing in terms of security credentials. He's one of the few prime ministers we've had who has not had significant military experience. And it's something that his political opponents have really held over him. And so if Prime Minister Lapid succeeds in making this a successful kind of limited mission, I think he would have really won some points coming into this November election.
There were a lot of accusations on social media that the entire reason for this operation was exactly what supposedly you said, the elections and Lapid's desire to show himself as a security leader, not just as a political leader. What's your take on that accusation?
My take on that is that the information that I've been exposed to is the information that you've been exposed to as well. I don't have insider information on this, and the IDF says that there was a concrete threat, that Palestinian Islamic Jihad planned to use an anti-tank missile against civilian and military targets in the south. In the 3 days preceding this operation, the south was on a virtual lockdown. Residents there had to remain in their homes. And so I think it would be a stretch to assume that all of this were political theater. That being said, I think he's likely very aware that this will be a feather in his cap if it ends successfully.
Right. You're mentioning the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and we have seen a separation in the course of this operation in the eyes of Israel and the IDF between Hamas and Islamic Jihad.
They're very different groups. They're very different groups. I think we often conflate them in the media because Palestinian Islamic Jihad is less well known. Whereas Hamas, in addition to being a terrorist organization, has a large civil affairs arm. It runs Gaza. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is not burdened by that. It is purely a military organization. Another difference is it's very small. And the third difference is it's basically backed by Iran. Money comes from a couple of other different sources, but it predominantly comes from Iran, such to the point that it would not be a stretch to call Palestinian Islamic Jihad an Iranian proxy. I believe its leader is actually sitting in Tehran right now, probably receiving some pressure to not give up the fight without some sort of concrete win that could be perceived in Gaza against Israel. So there's a difference between the two. In fact, Hamas has been doing its utmost to stay out of the fray.
Right.
There was a fear in Israel that had Hamas joined the operation, that it would be much more expensive. Hamas is way better armed than Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It has better weapons, has more of them. It's another reason why we've seen significant numbers of rockets, but we haven't seen the numbers of rockets that we saw last May. Hamas is much more sophisticated. Hamas also has something to lose, whereas Palestinian Islamic Jihad does not. Hamas runs the Gaza Strip and needs to be able to maintain its grip on civil affairs there as well.
You're mentioning also sometimes a hidden fact to many of our viewers, the fact that really Hamas has something to lose, and that's the reason why it's supposedly sitting on the fence. The fact is that thousands and thousands of Gazan workers come out of Gaza to work in Israel every day. And at the very cusp of this conflict, I believe I've heard, there were supposed to be demonstrations inside Gaza on issues of cost of living and livelihoods right before this operation started. So there is a clear interest by Hamas to maintain its ability to control Gaza and Gazans in the current economic climate, right?
What a wonderful way for Israelis and Gazans to have something in common, to both be protesting about the high cost of living. It is true that Gazan workers have not been able to come into Israel since the start of the operation, I believe a little bit before, in fact. Today, the Erez crossing, through which many of them do traverse into Israel, was hit and damaged. There were no injuries because that was closed, that crossing. And I think we have to see what happens. I think you're absolutely right. I think Hamas has something to lose. And I think that not just the high cost of living, but the kind of restrictions that come into the Palestinian economy when a war is ongoing or an operation is ongoing, such as restrictions on fuel, which lead to the inability to produce enough energy. I heard on Israeli Army radio this morning that Gaza is currently on a 416 pattern, I believe, with energy, where you get a certain number of hours where you have power and then the majority you don't. It's difficult. It's very difficult. And Hamas obviously, as the ruling power in Gaza, is feeling that criticism.
Right. You are a media person, and I think that from a media perspective, I want to ask you, how do you think Israel is doing from a media perspective, from the IDF spokesperson unit, from the foreign ministry and other elements? What do you see from your direction? Is Israel doing a better job this time?
I think Israel lucked out. I think other things were on the world agenda, one of them being Taiwan, China and Taiwan. And Israel lucked out. It's not the top of mind issue right now. I don't think that there has been a huge strategic change in how Israel has been running its Hasbara explanation campaign. I think that we were lucky to not catch the news cycle. And if we do successfully close this operation before other stories wrap up, we might escape the brunt of usual censure.
Are you hearing the possible ceasefire? The discussion is that maybe tonight Israel and Islamic Jihad will reach a ceasefire?
That is what's expected. It's supposed to come into effect soon if it happens. We will see. I can't predict the future. Unfortunately, ceasefires are often broken in this region. I do hope that this one holds.
I want to talk for a minute about the background to this cycle of violence. What happened was that Israel arrested an Islamic Jihad leader in Judea and Samaria, which prompted this. Explain a little bit for our viewers.
Yeah, Israel arrested a senior commander in the West Bank in a city called Jenin, which has been sort of a hotspot of terror activity over the past year.
Israel has been operating in that area for a while now as a result of the terror wave that Israel has seen recently.
Yeah, it's also the city where Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, and so it's been very much all over the news in Israel. It's been over the news internationally, even if viewers might not recognize the city name. It's been very central to this ongoing terror story. And the commander there was said to have been kind of arranging military resources, training, recruiting, and he was arrested to kind of curtail these activities. Israel expected a response, and this led to the lockdown. It wasn't just the expectation response that now came out after the fact that there was the credible threat of anti-tank missiles against civilian and military targets, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad's failure to back down from Israeli requests to withdraw this threat, to kind of come down off the ledge, led to this operation. This operation, I think, was carried out with somewhat an element of surprise against Islamic Jihad. It opened with a strike on the commander of its northern Gaza division. Last night, Israel also successfully targeted the commander of its southern Gaza division. So now Palestinian Islamic Jihad has lost two of its senior commanders in the strip. And that is the high level of what happened.
Yeah, and the interesting element here is that basically Islamic Jihad wanted to tie what was happening in Judea and Samaria to what was happening in Gaza. That is to say that if you're doing this in Jenin in the West Bank, then we will retaliate by rockets in Gaza, which is a problematic equation for Israel, isn't it?
It's the equation that we also see Hamas playing out with. Hamas also, let's not forget, started last summer's 11-day war with Israel on the basis, or operation, I believe it's called an operation, with Israel on the basis of, quote, violating the Al-Aqsa complex in Jerusalem. So a lot of Palestinian groups, even if they're based in Gaza, want to see themselves as defenders of Jerusalem, as defenders of the West Bank, as kind of pan-Palestinian. It's a very common narrative. It's not a new one.
Right, and the defending Jerusalem narrative is upheld by them in spite of the fact that both last year and this year we have seen alarms, red alert in that area, haven't we?
We have. We saw actually, I believe this morning there was a rocket launch close to Jerusalem, and I apologize, we're getting close to the ceasefire time, so I might have to go.
Okay.
News calls.
We'll squeeze in one last question before you go, Carrie. You are dealing with Israeli politics a lot. Anything you want to tell us about the impending elections? I'm sure we're going to hear more about the elections as time progresses from you, but anything you want to say in light of this operation as it pertains to the Israeli elections?
The elections are far off. Much can change in between. I think, unfortunately, this fifth round of elections in the last less than 4 years is also going to turn on this question of yes or no to former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It will also, to some extent, turn on cost of living, although no candidate has yet produced an actual credible cost of living action plan. Right now, it's much more speeches about going to tackle cost of living without steps to follow through upon. I think that we're in a situation where the so-called change bloc that led this last outgoing coalition is not in a position to form a government again on its own. The cleanest chance of forming a government would be if Netanyahu's right religious bloc gains a simple majority on its own. That is back and forth in the polls. It is really anyone's game. Everything is open. We will keep chatting about this, I'm sure.
Israeli politics like Israeli politics. Thank you so much, Carrie, for your insights. And as Israel's elections are nearing, like I said, I'll believe we'll hear so much more from you in the coming month. In the meantime, just stay safe out there and keep up the great reporting. It's always a pleasure to hear your analysis.
Thanks so much, Shahar.
Thank you all for watching, and to all, stay safe and stay healthy. We send our love and support to the people of Israel, and as always, we pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I'd like to thank our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's managing director, Dara Golob, our technical manager, Michael Paley, transmission manager, John McDevitt, and to our wonderful producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. For JBS, I'm Shahar Azani. Until next time, shalom and lehitraot. May we see better times.